Thank you. Oh boy, am I going to challenge that Southern thing. First of all, I want to acknowledge Pete Koshnick. If you've noticed on the board, Pete Koshnick was to be the teller tonight. And Pete and he and his wife have come down with COVID. So I ask you to keep them in your hearts. And I have really big shoes to fill subbing for Pete. First of all, he's one of the funniest tellers I've ever heard. But more importantly, I really have big shoes to fill because he's a big guy. So Pete, I'm doing this for you, buddy. I also want to acknowledge one other person in this room. This gentleman takes every photo of every show in this room. He also is shooting a video for every show in this room, Mr. Paul King. Unlike what Charlie just said, I'm here because I'm a byproduct of the South and Appalachia. Let me begin. My grandparents, on both my maternal and paternal side of the family, escaped the horror and misery and death of the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe at the turn of the last century. The pogroms, if you're not familiar, was either state-sponsored or state-ignored mayhem, murder, and just total attempt to annihilate Jews in Eastern Europe. So with that as a background, I am a byproduct of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia by way of Russia. When I say Russia, you better listen. Well, my maternal grandparents, the Zelens, Z-E-L-I-E-N, escaped from Minsk, then Russia, now Belarus. And it really wasn't Minsk. It was a shtetl. A shtetl is Yiddish for a Jewish village outside of a town where Jews were not allowed to be in. So they were in this shtetl, and all the horror and mayhem was around them, and they decided it's time to set sail. So my grandfather, my Zadie, that's Yiddish for grandfather, Benjamin, and my bubby, or grandmother, Bertha, took their two young children, little Harry, who was 6, my Uncle Harry, and then my Aunt Ida, who was like 3. And they also brought Bertha's mother, Sarah, on that voyage, and they came to America and settled in the American South, Atlanta, Georgia. They came to Atlanta because my grandmother's family was already there, and they had heard about the streets being lined with gold. Very quickly, my grandparents learned that's a myth. With the help of the family, they were able to buy a little shop. My grandfather had been a butcher in the old country. So he got this little shop with a 3-room above the store, literally, and that's where the family of eventually 7 lived, in those 3 rooms. And the other 2 that came along were my Aunt Lily, or Lil, who was born in 1911, and rounding out the brood was my mother, Ella, who was born in 1915. My grandfather, Benjamin, was such a generous man to a fault. He knew about the misery, the starvation, the heartache in the old country. He was not about to let his neighbors go through the same. The store was on Peachtree Street in the African-American, very poverty-stricken area of Atlanta. My Zadie granted credit to every customer that needed it that came through that door. And often, more often than not, was not paid back. But he felt so good about it because he knew he was doing the right thing. My mother had some success in Atlanta, too. She was part of a beauty pageant when she was 15 years old. And by the way, she was really beautiful until the end. But she was in this beauty pageant, and she won. She was so surprised because she was in the pool swimming when they called her up. And you may know the man who presented that award. The man that presented that award, a Jewish guy from Atlanta, Georgia, you knew as Bert Parks from Miss America. My mom still had what she called the loving cup, or the trophy, to prove it. Life was tough, but for some reason, Benjamin kept that family together. Eventually, the three sisters moved up to Cincinnati, where after their parents died, I was born in 1950. I never met the Zellen, my grandparents, because they both died at age 53, although my grandfather preceded my grandmother in death by a few years. I wish I had met them because I've heard so many good stories. This is one. When they were escaping Russia, they were on an immigrant ship. The immigrant ships were terrible. They were infested. People were getting sick. People actually were getting sick and dying, and they would have to throw the bodies overboard. Well, they still steamed ahead to that Statue of Liberty because that's where they were going. And when they got to New York Harbor, everybody went nuts. They grabbed confetti and they threw it in the air, and we're having such a great time. Little Harry was a Mossack. If you don't speak Yiddish, that's an impetuous little boy that can easily get in trouble and just as easily get out because of his cute little putum. Believe me, I know that. Well, Harry wanted none of this unless he could join in, so the Zellens brought 2 suitcases with them with all of their worldly possessions. That's all they had. Harry got into one suitcase, found all the clothes, picked it up, and threw it overboard. The Zellens left Russia with very little, and they arrived with even less. It was so strange. After my mother passed in 2001, I was going through her documents, and I found a real shocker. Remember, this is the Deep South. I found the 1920 census report done in Atlanta, Georgia by the U.S. Census takers, and it read, Benjamin Zellen, head of household, country of origin, Russia, race, Negro. What? But I did a little research, and you know what? That was very common in the Deep South, because if you think about it, 1920 was 56 years after the Civil War. The venom, the hatred, the prejudice was still there. If you were not a white Christian, chances are you might have been labeled as Negro. Be you Italian, Native American, African American, Catholic, anybody that wasn't white Christian. So, I found out that indeed, I do have Southern blood running through me. On the other side of the family, it was also a terribly arduous journey, but it was caused by something that was so horrific, so awful, that my grandparents on my father's side had to leave. Abraham Fink and Celia Fink, my Zadie and Bubby on my other side, had to leave. They had a little house, a very little house in the shtetl, somewhere around Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Russia. And the Cossack thugs came in one night and burnt the house down. Getting out were my grandparents and their 3 eldest children, Max, Isidore, and Emma. But in the house, the 2 that didn't get out was a set of twins that were less than a year old, and they perished. That caused my family to move over. It wasn't politics. It wasn't money. It was to life. L'chaim. And so they came. And their family, who they followed, was Celia's family, said, you got to come to West Virginia, the Appalachian Mountains. And that's where they moved. Now, my grandfather was this, by the way, I'm not exactly 6'5". I'm 5'6" and dyslexic. Yeah, I'm 6'5", that's right. Well, anyway, my grandfather was the short, little Jewish man that was wearing the schmatas from the old country, and he had the beard, and he looked funny. But the Appalachian people did not seem to mind. In fact, the Appalachian people were treated as outsiders by American mainstream. You've heard the term hillbillies? Well, to them, my grandfather represented another group who was let on the outside of the American midstream. So they actually treat him very kindly. In fact, one of them brought over a bottle of moonshine. I know that because when I was 17, I found it in my parents' storage locker, and I thought this was pretty cool, a 17-year-old having some hooch. And I thought it was okay until I realized, oh, is this stuff terrible, and spit it out. But yeah, he had moonshine. He learned English from these kind Appalachian people. He had to learn because he was carrying all of his stuff on his donkey as a peddler going around the mountains. He had cans and pots and pans and shmatas, which is Yiddish for rags or clothes. So he would go around the mountains and he had to learn English. He used English as a tool because he became the town crier, he became the gossip monger, and the Walter Cronkite of Appalachia, spreading news from village to village. So he had to learn English. In 1959, my grandmother, my bubby Celia, died. And it was an accident. My father was helping her to the car, and it was a terribly rainy night. She slipped and fell, broke her hip, and died 2 weeks later. My grandfather wasn't able to be alone. So after some time, he came to live with us. We were not wealthy. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. But my grandfather came to live with us, which meant my sister and I had shared a room. Hold the judgment, please. We shared a room. She had to move to the couch, and Zadie Abraham became my roommate. He became my pal. I was a Mossack too, and I didn't like going to school, so I would, no offense to any teachers here, including my wife, who was a retired professor, I didn't like going to school. So I would pretend to be sick. Now, the reason is my mother was a terrible, terrible, awful cook. But she had to keep kosher for my grandfather. So she always fetched or complained about having to keep kosher. And I used that. I told my Zadie, I love kosher food. If it wasn't cooked by my mother, I love kosher food. And then when I needed to get out of going to school, it was Abraham that got me out by saying, he was a little ill last night. Let him stay home. Yeah. Well, eventually, my mother, the narcissist, and she really was a narcissist, said she could take no more. Abraham had to go to the Jewish Home for the Aged in Cincinnati. It was a pit of a place. It was just awful. But I loved going there to see my grandpa with my dad, Joe. By the way, Joe had been born in Nashville, and before they went to Louisville, where they ended up, they were in Nashville because I'm a little out of sync here, but they followed Abraham and Celia's family from Nashville to Louisville. People said in the family it was because Abraham found a better job. I don't think so. Joseph, no middle name, Fink, my dad, was born July 2nd, 1914 in Davidson County, otherwise known as Nashville, Tennessee. Southern blood, man, I'm telling you, Southern blood. And I think this is the reason they had to move to Louisville. If anybody here says Louisville, see me outside. It's Louisville. The reason I think is when my dad was about 9 years old, he and a buddy, these two geniuses, decided they were going to try to smoke what was called Indian cigars, catalpa bean seeds, these long things. So they went up to an old barn, they went up to the rafters where there was hay, they lit up their catalpa bean seeds, took a couple of whiffs, and immediately turned as green as that seed. They got sick, and they just ran out of the barn. They threw the cigars aside. When they turned around, the barn was ablaze. Boy, did they get a scalping when they got home. And I am convinced that's the real reason why I had to get out of Nashville and move to Louisville, which they did. But the family thrived in Louisville. And like I said, in 1959, after my grandmother died and Abraham came to live with us, my dad and I would have to go to the Jewish Home for the Aged to see my grandfather in this like 8x8 small, disgusting room. But I loved it. First of all, I got to see my grandfather, but my grandfather had a sweet tooth. The room was overloaded with candy. It had my favorite, M&Ms and Hershey Kisses. I felt like a Jewish kid in Willy Wonka's Jewish candy house. It was great. But there was another experience I remember all too clearly. My father, Joe, wanted to show his father, Abraham, how tough his kid was. So on one visit, I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, boom! My father hits me in the arm as hard as he could. All of a sudden, the roles reversed. My grandfather became the father, and Joe became his son when he scolded him and said, Yosel, Yosel, no, the Kinder. That's Joe, stop, the child. Well, it was about 10 o'clock one night, and my dad gets a call letting us know that this amazing man who had so much torture and pain in his life died. We went to Louisville for the funeral, and we were in the family room with an open casket. And I saw this sweet man with a round face that never smiled. I never saw my grandfather smile because he endured so much pain in his life. I saw that and I cried a gusher. I cried, I couldn't stop. Finally, after 50 years of therapy, I think I'm getting better. My parents were what I would call twice-a-year Jews, which meant they went to temple during the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Other than that, they stayed home. And I think I kind of followed suit. I am Jewish by culture, by tradition, and I have faith, but I just don't believe in organized religion. So, I'm spiritually Jewish, culturally Jewish, and gastronomically Jewish. Let me give you an illustration. My friend Randy and I, before COVID, would drive a total of a 7-hour trip to go to Charlotte for tongue sandwiches. Now, before I see everybody turn their nose and go, think about this. Moses would have been so jealous. He slept 40 years in the desert trying to find a homeland and good old Jewish home cooking. Randy and I found it 7 hours away. But today, I am a byproduct of Appalachia, of the American South, Russia. But most of all, I myself am so proud of my families that risked everything so that I could be here tonight and share this with you. Oy vey! I gotta leave! I got a hankering for matzo ball soup and tongue. Shalom. Shalom. Peace. Thank you. Oh, by the way, before I leave, I'm about to show you something that is very precious to me. For those that don't know, this is called a tallis. And Jewish people, Jewish men, wear it when they pray. This is from my grandfather Abraham from Russia, who gave this to me. And I remember going to shul with him, and after he would wear it, he would take it off and go, Shalom. Peace. Thank you.